Good evening. As John said, my name's Kirstine. I'm one of the leaders here. A particular warm welcome to those of us that have just spent the last 24 hours together. I appreciate how tired you are. Well done on being here. I'm not going to speak for too long. And a particular warm welcome to those of you who are normally with us on Wednesdays but weren't able to make the weekend away. It's really, really great to have you with us this evening. And hello to everyone else. It's encouraging to hear those stories, isn't it? It's encouraging to hear those stories, isn't it? Wakey, wakey, everybody. You can't be as tired as me. As John said, we've spent the last sort of 24 hours on Southend-on-Sea, which was nothing but wonderful. I had the best time at Adventure Island, going on roller coasters, living my best little life. And we went so that we could have, to see whether or not we could have an experience of God. And spoiler alert, the answer is yes, you can, as those stories testified to. And at the beginning of July, I moved up to Wembley Park. And I don't know if you've ever been to Wembley Park and if you've ever made a journey up to the stadium. But basically, when you arrive at the tube station, there's like 4 flights of stairs to go down. And what happens is that people arrive at the stadium, and if you imagine that the arc is there, they do this. And us locals have to go around them to go down the stairs, and it's so infuriating. But what I've noticed is that what happens is they often turn up in fancy dress, because it turns out that in Wembley we hold lots of immersive theatre events. And so at the moment we've got Guardian of the Galaxies going on, and so there's all these different tribes that turn up in different colours. And as they walk along the street up towards the stadium, they'll talk about, that's orange team, they're against us, or that's red people, we don't like them, or that's a blue person, we like them. And all these conversations go on, and it kind of dawned on me recently just how much we like to be a part of the narrative, how much we like an immersive experience. And if that's not your cup of tea, then I bring you good news this evening, because round the corner from us, a cat cafe's opened. You can pay £25 to go and stroke the cats in the cat cafe, just around on Marylebone High Street. It's just around the corner. And apparently it's very popular. It is not my cup of tea, but I am tempted to book tickets to puppy yoga. Apparently you don't get to take the puppies home with you, but you can go and you can do your stretching and become all zen, watch little 8-week-old puppies run around you. It looks ever so cute, and my Instagram must know that I'm quite interested, because I get spammed for ads every day where it's like, it's in this location today, it's in that location today. But I just think London's a city that is all about experience. We are hungry and desperate for experiences, and when I moved to London, it was part of the appeal of this city for me. I kind of moved from a small town up to the big city in order to see what experiences there were. And from the cafes to the markets to the bars and to the boys, I just loved it all. I was like, this is an amazing city. There's always something going on. But what I didn't think for one moment was that I would end up in a church, or that I'd have friends who are Christians, let alone a relationship with Jesus myself. And yet, full disclosure, I would say that it was an unexpected encounter with Jesus that completely and utterly transformed my life. And I'm going to talk more on that a little bit later, but I just want to start by looking at 2 different experiences that people had with Jesus in the Gospels. And just in case you don't know, the Gospels are the first 4 books of the New Testament, and it tells the story of Jesus. And he would have been a Middle Eastern brown-skinned man. He would have spoke Aramaic at home and read the biblical Hebrew in the synagogue. And the first story we're going to look at is in John 4, and it's verses 1 to 26. And rather than read it to you, I'm going to tell you it from the Kirstine Authorized Version. I'm going to picture it together, and then later on I'll read another story from the actual Bible, just to please you all. But the first one takes place around a watering well in a town called Samaria in ancient Israel. And the setting of the story is it's about midday, and the heat is blisteringly hot. And Jesus has been traveling all day. He's been with people, he's been teaching people, he's been praying for people, and he reaches a watering well with his disciples. And he says to his disciples, hey, could you go and get some food? And I'm just going to wait right here. And it's at this point that a Samaritan woman starts to approach the well. And she sees Jesus, and Jesus sees her. And what's really important to note in this moment is that for Middle Eastern women, they traveled to the well in groups. They didn't travel alone. They traveled in groups, partly for safety reasons. There was safety in numbers. They often traveled either early in the morning or late in the evening in order to avoid the blistering heat of the midday sun. But they also had these big jars that they would have filled with water so they didn't have to make multiple trips back and forth to the well. And they would have needed more than one of them to lift them and carry them because they were heavy. The only women at the time who travelled alone to the well were the ones deemed bad by society. And culturally, what would have happened at the time is if a woman approached the well and there was a man there, the man would have moved 20 feet at least away in order to signal to the woman that it's okay, you can approach the well now. I've moved back, I've signaled to you it's okay, and you can go. But Jesus doesn't, he stays. He doesn't move an inch. And instead, he breaks a 500-year-old tension that exists between the Jews and the Samaritans. And the woman draws closer. And then Jesus dares to speak to her. And he asks her for a drink. And she replies, you know, Jesus, you're a Jew and I am a Samaritan woman. How can you ask me for a drink? There's a bit of back and forth in the scriptures of arguing between them. And then Jesus says this: everyone who drinks this water will be thirsty again. But whoever drinks the water I give them will never thirst. Indeed, the water I give them will become in them a spring of life, welling up to eternal life. You see, she's acutely aware of the culture in which she lives. And what goes on to happen is actually Jesus calls her out in her actions again, and she calls Jesus out for even speaking to her and not moving the way in the cultural way that he should have. And it kind of goes back and forth, and Jesus eventually says to her, do you know you've had 5 husbands and the man you're with now is not your husband? And we're not told the reasons as to why she's had multiple husbands, or maybe it's just multiple serious encounters with men. Simply that it's happened. And not only that, but the whole town know about it. That she is paying a high price for her behavior. She's been outcast by her society and therefore has to do this trip alone. But I just want to acknowledge that she is a woman living within a patriarchal society. One in which men, particularly wealthy men and men who held positions of power, would have controlled the narrative. And so at the time, men could divorce with just one word. They could just dismiss the woman. And so let's not pretend when we read this piece of scripture that men and women were treated equally, because that wouldn't have been the case. And she is ultimately going to pay a higher price for the immorality within her culture. But there's other questions that we should ask. It's not just about the fact that she had these 5 husbands and now she's got a new man. You know, within the culture, you would have been with your family. So where on earth are her family within there? Where are the women that are her sisters, her sister-in-laws, her mother, her aunties, her cousins? Where are they in this story? Because they're also not with her. Why haven't they taken her back in? What's happened to cause such a breakdown of relationship? And we're not told the reason that she approaches the well at midday. Yes, the other women had scorned her and didn't want her in the group. We can kind of agree on that. But she could have also been approaching the well because it would have been a really common place to meet travelers as they move through. So for all we know, she's approaching that well to make a new connection, that she's looking for a new person. What we do know for certain is this woman has an encounter with a person who claims to be the Son of God. And what Jesus offers to this woman is an experience of the living God. Irrespective of the culture and the gender rules and the hierarchy and the patriarchal society, he says you can have an experience of the living God. And much of the Gospels where these stories are written would have been written in ancient Greek. And in ancient Greek, there are 2 words for life. One is boias, which means your physical body, like our physical part of us. But the other one is called Zoe. And Zoe speaks about the spiritual life. And when Jesus says to this woman, I will give you life, eternal life, he is saying to her, I will give you Zoe life. I will give you life to the fullest. That's the offer that he's offering her. No longer do you have to live in a place where you live outcast from your community. You no longer have to be alone. You no longer have to be shamed. Rather, you can experience unconditional love. You can have Zoe life through an encounter with the living God. That's what he offers her. A really good friend of mine would have described life as always being a pattern of seeking the next fulfilling moment. Yoga, meditations, fancy retreats in faraway lands and social media detox. She was doing it all, always looking for the next fulfilling moment, always looking for the next spiritual high. She describes climbing Mount Kilimanjaro and reaching the very top of it. And she said as she got there and she looked around, it was awe-inspiring, it was breathtaking. And then like 2 days later, she was just like, what next? What next? She went on a course much like the life course, and just as we've done over the weekend away, she was offered an opportunity to meet with the living God, to experience the Holy Spirit. And she opened herself. She had this overwhelming sense of feeling loved. This overwhelming sense of life could be more than what it had been. And she would say that in being filled with the Spirit and continuing to be filled with the Spirit, that it's met that desire for more. That she has life in all of its fullness, that in a way that nothing else ever came close. My story was that as a child, my dad was an alcoholic and he was incredibly abusive. And so I grew up in an environment in which really dictated to me that I wasn't going to be loved. And my dad went to great lengths to do that. And My mum, for all the best will in the world, she just wasn't able to offer that to us. Through stuff that happened to her in her past, it meant actually she wasn't able to extend love to her kids. That wasn't the reality that was on the table. And so I kind of grew up this narrative and became really, really independent. I wasn't going to trust anybody. I didn't really want anyone to come too close to me. I just thought everyone's out on their own little path. And actually, certainly as an adult, I got to a point where, as I say, I moved up to London. I was never going to go back home to where my family came from, even though I saw them. And I just loved the experience. But what I loved was that I was independent. Nothing came close to the things that happened in the past. And I felt that I could just leave it all in the past. And I certainly was not looking for faith when I moved up to London. It was not on my radar. And a friend invited me to come to church with her, and some of you have heard me say this before, but when I walked into the church building, I had this overwhelming sense that I'd come home. I suddenly felt that I'd found this place in which I could belong. And I'd go to church each Sunday, and I'd actually sit up in a balcony in order to watch what was happening amongst the congregation as people would worship and put their hands in the air, and I would think, what on earth are you doing? Or they would come to the front for ministry, and I'd watch what would happen. And I'd wonder what it was that they were experiencing. And then on one evening, much like tonight, I decided I'd give it a go myself, that I would come to the front and see if all these things they were talking about, this God being a good father, the way in which you could experience love, the way in which you could be fully known, was it actually true? And so I came to the front and opened myself, and I had this overwhelming experience of feeling loved. It's the only way I can describe it, like to the depths of my soul. I felt loved and known. And it was an ongoing process and continues to be an ongoing process to restore that part of me that actually was broken as a child. But the revelation part was, it wasn't what were my friends experiencing, it was the who my friends were experiencing, the living God. Let's look at another person in the Bible. It's going to come up on the screen. It's in Luke 19, 1-10. It's the story of Zacchaeus, the tax collector. It says this: Jesus entered the city of Jericho and was passing through. There was a man there by the name of Zacchaeus, and he was a chief tax collector and was wealthy. He wanted to see who Jesus was, but because he was short, he could not see over the crowd. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore fig tree to see him, since Jesus was coming that way. When Jesus reached the spot, he looked up and said to him, "Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today." So he came down at once and welcomed him gladly. All of the people saw this and began to mutter, "He's gone to the house of the guest of the sinner." But Zacchaeus stooped up and said to the Lord, "Look, Lord, here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor, and if I cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount." And Jesus said to him, "Today salvation has come to this house, because this man too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost." So this second story happens within a town called Jericho. And Jericho is in the Palestinian city on the West Bank. It's located in the valley of Jordan. And Jordan River would have been to the east and Jerusalem to the west. And the story focuses upon a tax collector. And the system of collecting tax within the day, it wasn't done through HMRC like us. It was in a system called tax farming. And the local person who acquired the rights to collect taxes for Rome was expected to give a certain amount to the authorities, but then they could keep some for themselves. And the exact amount would have been predetermined for every single household as they went round to collect it. And so it's fair to say that the tax collectors were despised because everybody knew they took a bit extra for themselves. The whole system produced economic injustice and was open to extorting others for one's own gain. So Zacchaeus, the central guy in this story, he worked not for the good of his community, but rather for the Roman Empire and for himself. And we know from the text that Zacchaeus made it in with the ruling power, for he's the chief tax collector. In other words, we can absolutely happily say that Zacchaeus was a greedy bastard who was very, very good at his job. And Jesus had been going from town to town and healing the sick and welcoming the sinner and eating with the outcast, and all these stories are happening, and it would have been passed from town to town to town. And so as Jesus moves through the city of Jericho, he's not planning on staying the night. The text tells us he's just passing through. He's not there to have an encounter with somebody necessarily. And Zacchaeus hears the rumors that this person called Jesus is coming through the town. And he's got curiosity enough to want to see who this person is. But there's a problem because he's really short. So I think he's got 3 options. He can go home and miss out. He can push his way through the crowds to the very front and therefore see Jesus. Or he has to get above the crowd. For undisclosed reasons, Zacchaeus doesn't want to not see Jesus, so the going home option isn't there. He's got to stay. But as we've already said, Zacchaeus would have taken money from people and kept extra for himself. He's not liked by the townspeople, so he doesn't trust that they're going to let him through, understandably so. And even if he does try and push his way through the crowds, what on earth are they going to do to him? Because he's short. We could easily deal with Zacchaeus and have more money for ourselves. He's only got one option left. He's got to get above the crowd. Now, in our modern day world, certainly outside of London, if you think about climbing trees, it evokes beautiful childhood memories, right? The freedom, the playfulness, the slight bit of danger as we get higher and higher in the trees. Or maybe you've got memories of an adult having to rescue you as you climb to the very top of the tree once again. But this wouldn't have been the case for Zacchaeus. You see, to climb a tree in his society was a risky strategy. Middle Eastern men did not run in public if they wanted to avoid shaming, and rich and powerful men definitely did not climb trees. And yet Zacchaeus runs to get ahead of the crowd, and he climbs a sycamore fig tree. And the reason that it's important that we know it's a sycamore fig tree is because they were seen as unclean within the day. Within the Jewish teachers of Menashe, the trees were explicitly labeled as an unclean tree, and they would have been on the outside of the town. And if you had one in your garden and the branches were really big and they would go over into your neighbor, you were responsible for cutting them down, for they were an unclean tree. Even the figs that they produced, whilst we love them today, we love fig jam, don't we? We love having eaten the figs. They're a great fruit for us. They were bad in the day. They were only ever fed to pigs. And so it leads us to think, what on earth are you thinking, Zacchaeus? You've done a total social faux pas. Not only have you hiked up your robes, exposing your ankles, not only have you ran in public, you've now climbed the branches of a tree in order to see somebody. Everything he does in that moment threatens his position of power and authority if he is seen by others. And I think it's often argued that the reason Zacchaeus did this was for connection, that he wanted to see Jesus, that he knew something about Jesus, that there was this desire to meet with Jesus. And I wondered more if it was actually, it's not a desire in a good way to want to see Jesus, but rather he wants to see the very person who's contradicting the way he's choosing to live. The person who challenges whose teaching on money would have challenged him. Zacchaeus is wealthy. There's no denying the fact that his idol was money. He worked in order to get more of it. He built his entire world around it. And there's Jesus who teaches against it, who says, I am the living God. And we don't know for sure why Zacchaeus responds to Jesus, but we know he does respond to Jesus. In the rest of the passage, Jesus welcomes Zacchaeus down from the tree. He goes to his house for dinner. And again, we don't know what's said in that house. Many people have debated about it, but we don't actually know what happened in that house. But we do see the actions afterwards. We see that Zacchaeus comes out completely changed. I'll pay back what I've taken. I'll restore the things to my community. Total and utter transformation. You see, Zacchaeus' meaning, purpose, and security up until that point had come through work and wealth. And yet I think in that house, Jesus offers Zacchaeus Zoe life. Life in all of its fullness. And it's undeniable to Zacchaeus who this is sat in front of him. Jesus offers Zacchaeus an encounter with the living God. The only one who offers life in all of its fullness. The only one who can come into all of our situations and restore and bring complete healing. Let me tell you a story about another friend of mine. This is a friend of mine who did really well at university, quite surprisingly, and got accepted onto a competitive grad scheme. They then got in with a prestigious London company. When they moved to London, they randomly, like what it's like when you move to London or, you're looking for someone to live. They went on to myspareroom.com. And they found this room, and they're like, great, that'll do. That's the one. It's within budget. It's in a location. It's with 3 other people. It'll be fine. In they move. What they didn't know is they'd moved in with a Christian. And my friend had no experience of Christianity. They did not grow up going to church. Their only experience of it was around Christmas time when they sang Away in the Manger. That was kind of their whole reference for who Jesus was. This babe born in a stable. Great, I get presents. Wonderful. Tick the box. They had never entered the doors of a church. And yet they found themselves living with this Christian. And what they said is that this flatmate of theirs had undeniable peace. In all situations, this undeniable peace. And what would happen is they would go to the pub, and my friend would question their flatmate about where this peace came from. And their friend would say, it's Jesus. Or they'd sit up late in the night, and all these questions would flood again, and their friend, he would say to his flatmate, what is the peace? And his friend would say Jesus. And eventually my mate got so frustrated with the answer being Jesus that he thought, do you know what, I'll go to church and check it out for myself. So he goes to church for his flatmate. When doing ministry, he comes forward, he opens himself. He's prayed for by several people, and he would say experienced nothing. There wasn't an overwhelming sense of love in that moment. And he goes home and he's actually really disappointed. That God, I thought you might be real, and I allowed myself to open myself to you, and you did not show up. And so in the privacy of his bedroom, he says to God, if you're real, make yourself known to me. And in that moment has an experience of feeling overwhelmingly loved, starts weeping, and in that moment welcomes Jesus in. And he would say that he went from looking at life in quite a black and white way. There was right and there was wrong. And that one encounter, being filled with the Holy Spirit, completely transformed the way in which he views the world. He would say he suddenly saw all these things in colour, but it was this one moment. You see, Jesus spent his life revealing himself to people through the Gospels. With Zacchaeus, he went to people's house for tea. With the blind man, he restored sight. With the disciples, he taught them and gave them purpose. And with the woman at the well, he gives her life in all of its fullness. And he did it quite simply so that they would know that they are loved. And I'm not surprised that society, particularly those of you that are in the younger generation category, that you're more open spiritually than previous generations. That you've rightly discerned that we are spiritual beings, that we like to and desire to be in touch with the spiritual side of life, and you're completely correct within that. The very reason that manifesting and visualization courses are on the rise is because we want the assurance that something outside of ourselves, a higher power if you like, can offer us something about life. And maybe you're here and you've tried manifesting. You've made your list, you've visualized it in your mind, you've offered it out into the universe. All the things that your heart desires. I believe that in those moments you unwittingly connect with the maker of the universe, the creator of heaven and earth, the living God. And the truth is about God is that he will use any way he can to connect with you, because that's his uttermost desire. For you to come into a place of realization that he loves you because he created you. And God isn't this far off God, waiting and watching our every move, waiting for the moment in which we get it wrong to come smite us down. That is not who God is. God doesn't sit on a throne of judgment waiting for the day that we go up heaven's escalator to get to the pearly gates to tell us all the things that we have done wrong in life. That isn't who God is. Instead, I'm utterly convinced that it's God, the creator of the universe, who chose to reveal themselves by slipping into skin and walked amongst us. And it's the love and grace and mercy of Jesus that was so offensive to us as humans that we put him on a cross, for God to only go and resurrect him 3 days later for our sake. That as you've heard through the stories that have been shared tonight, that God comes close as hands and feet and as near as breathing. He offers us a chance to get to know him, to know what it is to be loved by him. So I want to suggest to you that God is real, that he likes you, that he likes me, and the only way in which you will experience life in all of its fullness is through an encounter with the living God,